"Tell me, June," the king whispered, his large hand wrapping around the back of my neck. Not to hurt, but to hold, to control. "If you are truly as simple as you pretend to be, why did your pulse just spike when I mentioned the border treaty?" I froze. I forced my eyes to stay wide and vacant, forced my mouth to hang open just a fraction of an inch, the way I practiced in the mirror every morning. I stared at the silver button on his coat, willing my heart to slow down, willing the terrified bird in my chest to stop beating its wings against my ribs. "Pretty button," I mumbled, slurring the words just enough to sound harmless. "Shiny." Declan didn't buy it. He didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped closer, pinning me against the cold stone wall of the library. His scent, rain, ozone, and pure, terrifying power, flooded my senses. He lowered his head until his lips were brushing the shell of my ear, his hot breath sending a shiver violently down my spine. "Liar," he growled softly, the vibration traveling straight to my core. "I saw you fix that map. I saw the intelligence in your eyes before you dimmed them. You aren't simple, little wolf. You're dangerous. And I think I'm going to enjoy unraveling every single one of your secrets." My knees went weak. For 5 years I had been invisible, safe. Now the most lethal alpha in the world had me in his sights. And looking into his burning gold eyes, I realized the scariest part wasn't that he might kill me. It was that he wanted to claim me. Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If that shiver running down your spine feels familiar, then you are exactly where you belong. Then we are diving into a story of high stakes, hidden identities, and an obsession that burns hotter than fire tonight. Before we let the king make his next move, please take a quick moment to like this video. It helps our pack find each other in the dark. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and the bell so you never miss a chapter. For those of you who want to get even closer to the heat, consider joining our channel membership for exclusive perks. I want to feel your presence with me tonight. Go ahead and drop a comment below, telling me where you are listening from in the world right now. Are you safe in bed? Driving through the rain? Let me know. Now, take a deep breath. Let's see if June can survive the king. Chapter 1. The Art of Being Unseen. If you blink too rapidly, you look anxious. If you stare too hard, you look aggressive. The secret to looking entirely vacant, to looking like there isn't a single thought behind your eyes, is to focus on something completely irrelevant. Tonight, I was focusing on the third button of Alpha Jareth's velvet coat. It was brass, slightly tarnished around the edges, and hanging by a loose thread. I bet myself 10 credits it would pop off before the appetizers were served. "June!" my father hissed, his voice dropping to that fake, pitying tone he reserved for public appearances. "Try not to drool on your dress. The High King arrives within the hour, and I will not have you embarrassing the pack with your difficulties." I let my jaw go slack. It was a practiced motion, a loosening of the muscles that made my face look heavy and dull. I widened my eyes until they glazed over, and staring past his shoulder at the flickering sconces on the stone wall. "Pretty lights," I murmured, pitching my voice to be slow and thick, warm. My father sighed, a sound of long-suffering martyrdom that had the desired effect on the surrounding dignitaries. They looked at him with sympathy, and at me with dismissal. That was the goal. Dismissal was safety. In the cutthroat politics of the Nightfall territory, being intelligent was a death sentence for a female without a powerful mate. If they thought I was sharp, they would trade me like currency. If they thought I was simple, I was just a burden to be ignored. I had spent 5 years perfecting this armor of incompetence, hiding a mind that could calculate crop yields and treaty renegotiations while pretending to struggle with a soup spoon. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open, the sound reverberating through the stone floor and up into the soles of my shoes. The chatter in the room didn't just stop, it was severed. A silence so profound fell over the crowd that I could hear the wind howling outside the fortress walls. Then came the scent. It wasn't the usual musk of aggressive males or the cloying perfume of the court ladies. It was the smell of a brewing storm, petrichor, wet slate, and the sharp electric tang of lightning striking the earth. It was a scent that bypassed my logic and slammed directly into my wolf, making her sit up and whine in my chest. High King Declan had arrived. I kept my head down, studying the scuffed toe of my boot, but I felt him. His presence was a physical weight in the room, pressing against the air like a rising tide. He moved with a predator's silence, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone as he walked past the bowing alphas and the preening lunas. He didn't acknowledge them. He was the apex, the monster in the dark that even the monsters feared, and he had no need for pleasantries. I held my breath, counting the seconds until he would pass me. 1, 2, 3. He didn't pass. The heavy footsteps stopped directly in front of me. The air grew colder, charged with that storm scent that made my skin prickle. I forced myself to remain limp, to keep my expression empty, even as my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up slowly, letting my gaze drift unfocused over his chest. He was massive, broad-shouldered, in a black military coat that cost more than my father's entire estate. But it was his face that froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't looking at my father. He wasn't looking at the alpha to my left. He was looking at me. His eyes were gold, not the muddy yellow of most wolves, but a burning molten gold that seemed to see right through my skin. There was no pity in his expression. There was only a terrifying clinical curiosity. "You are far too quiet," Declan said. His voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in my stomach. "For a room this loud, little wolf, your silence is deafening." Chapter 2. The Glitch in the Matrix. I waited until the music started. I waited until the wine was flowing and the alphas were too busy boasting about their territory borders to notice the simple girl slipping out the side door. The moment the heavy wood clicked shut behind me, the transformation was instantaneous. My spine straightened. The dull glaze vanished from my eyes, replaced by the sharp, calculating focus that I had to suppress every waking hour. I took a deep breath of the cold hallway air, finally allowing myself to be June. I moved quickly through the shadows of the Black Iron Manor, navigating the corridors by memory, until I reached the East Wing Library. No one came here. The Nightfall wolves preferred fighting rings to reading rooms, which made this dust-choked mausoleum of books my only sanctuary. I pushed inside, the smell of old parchment and leather wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I didn't waste time. I went straight to the long oak table where I had hidden the stolen treaty map earlier that morning. And it was a mess. The Nightfall strategists had miscalculated the grain supply lines for the southern ridge, a mistake that would starve 3 villages by midwinter if they didn't adjust for the elevation drop. "Idiots," I whispered, my voice clear and sharp in the silence. "Absolute incompetence." I grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace hearth and began to write. I crossed out their equations, my hand moving in a blur of motion. I sketched the correct supply route, calculating the drag coefficient for the wagons in the snow and the caloric needs of the guards. It felt good to use my brain. It felt like stretching a cramped muscle. I was muttering to myself as I worked, lost in the beautiful logic of the numbers. "If you move the depot to the eastern ridge, you save 4 days of travel," I said aloud, tapping the map with the charcoal-stained finger. "But you have to account for the river freezing over. And the avalanche risk on the pass," a deep voice added from the darkness. The sound hit me like a physical blow. I gasped, spinning around so fast I nearly knocked the heavy candelabra off the table. My heart slammed into my throat. I instinctively slumped my shoulders, letting my jaw drop, trying to revert to the safety of the mask, but I knew, with a sinking, nauseous dread, that I was too late. High King Declan stepped out from the shadows between the stacks. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat anymore. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the corded muscle of his throat. He looked relaxed. He looked lethal. He walked toward me, his gold eyes locked on my face. He didn't look at the map. He looked at me, dissecting me, peeling back the layers of my performance with a single glance. He stopped inches away, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "Don't," he said softly, before I could start my act. "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't just solve a logistical problem that has stumped my generals for a week." I couldn't breathe. My escape plan, my 5 years of careful work, my entire life, it was all crumbling. I stared at him, the charcoal still clutched in my trembling hand. Declan reached out. His fingers were rough, calloused from weapons, but his touch was shockingly gentle as he pried the charcoal from my grip. He looked at the black smudge on my fingers, then back to my wide, terrified eyes. A slow, dark smile spread across his face, one that promised trouble. "Remarkably steady handwriting," he murmured, stepping into my personal space until I was pressed against the table. "For a girl who can barely hold a spoon." Chapter 3. The Dangerous Game. "Pretty picture," I whispered, my voice trembling. It was a weak attempt, a desperate final grasp at the straw of my salvation. "I liked drawing lines." Declan laughed. It wasn't a cruel sound, which somehow made it worse. It was a low, rich sound of genuine amusement, like he had just found a diamond in a pile of coal and wasn't sure whether to sell it or keep it. He placed his hands on the table on either side of my hips, effectively boxing me in. I was trapped between the hard oak and the harder wall of his chest. "You like drawing lines," he repeated, his tone mocking. He leaned down, his face so close that I could count the flecks of amber in his golden irises. "And you also seem to like correcting topography errors and calculating grain distribution ratios. Tell me, June, where did a simple girl learn military logistics?" I turned my head away, refusing to meet his gaze. "Don't know what you mean. Let me go." "Drop the act," he commanded. The playfulness vanished, replaced by the steel of a king who was used to being obeyed instantly. "I heard your voice. The real voice. It's lower than the one you use out there. It's smoother. I like it better." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Please, if my father knows—" "Your father is a fool who thinks he owns you," Declan interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "He doesn't realize he has a weapon in his house, but I do." He moved one hand from the table to my chin, forcing me to look at him. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, a touch so intimate and shocking that a gasp tore itself from my throat. My wolf was pacing in my mind, confused by the mixture of fear and undeniable attraction. This was the High King. He could execute me for deception. He could throw me in the dungeons. But he wasn't calling the guards. He was staring at my mouth. "Why hide?" he asked, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "You are brilliant. You are cunning. Do you have any idea how rare that is in this frozen wasteland? You have been playing them all for fools." "I hide to survive," I snapped, the mask finally shattering completely. I glared at him, breathing hard. "Because men like you don't want brilliant women. You want trophies. You want obedient little decorations to sit by your throne and agree with you. I would rather be thought useless than be used." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I thought I had gone too far. I braced myself for his anger. Instead, Declan's eyes darkened with something scorching. It wasn't anger. It was hunger. "You think I want a decoration?" he whispered, leaning in until his lips brushed against my ear, sending shivers racing down every nerve ending I possessed. "I have a palace full of decorations, June. I'm bored to death of them. I don't want obedience." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, and the intensity of his gaze made my knees buckle. I'm going to enjoy breaking you, little liar, he promised, his voice rough with a dark promise that sounded terrifyingly like desire. Not your spirit, just your silence. Chapter 4. Dinner with the Predator. The seating arrangement at the high table was a calculated insult to my digestion. Usually, the simple daughter of a minor alpha would be shoved to the far end of the table, near the drafty door and the kitchen runners. But tonight, High King Declan had rearranged the place cards himself. I was seated directly at his right hand, the spot reserved for a queen or a favored diplomat, while my father sat opposite us, sweating profusely into his velvet collar and looking like he might faint from the sheer stress of hoping I didn't start chewing on the napkin. I stared at the roasted pheasant on my plate, gripping my fork with a fist like a toddler. "Bird!" I announced to the table at large, my voice pitched perfectly between wonder and stupidity. "Fly." Declan didn't even blink. He took a sip of his dark red wine, did the crystal goblet looking fragile in his large hand, and turned his burning gold gaze toward the trade delegation from the Iron River Pack. "Your proposal regarding the iron tariffs is interesting, Alpha Thorn," Declan said, his voice smooth and deceptively idle. "But you claim a 20% increase in output is impossible due to the frost line. My strategists believe the ground stays soft enough for mining until late, deep winter." "Impossible, Your Majesty," Alpha Thorn blustered, puffing out his chest. "The frost depth in the northern quadrant exceeds 4 feet by mid-season. We would break our equipment. A 10% increase is the maximum physical limit." I choked on a piece of bread. It was a lie, a blatant, lazy lie. As the frost depth in the northern quadrant never exceeded 2 feet because of the geothermal vents running under the ridge, a fact detailed in the very geological survey Thorn had signed 3 years ago. He was trying to hoard the iron to artificially inflate the price. My hand twitched on the table. The math was screaming in my head. 10% is theft, 20% is easy. You could push for 30 if you routed the steam vents. Suddenly, a large warm hand landed heavily on my thigh under the table. I froze, the bread turning to ash in my mouth. Declan's hand was massive, his thumb resting casually on the inside of my knee, creating a point of heat that seared through the silk of my dress. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on Thorn, but his thumb began to stroke slow, deliberate circles against my skin. It was possessive. It was grounding. It was a silent command to stay still, or perhaps a challenge to see if I would break. "Is that so?" Declan murmured to the lying alpha, his fingers tightening on my leg, just enough to make my breath hitch. "You hear that, gentlemen? Thorn says the physics of the Earth have changed. How unfortunate." He squeezed my thigh, a firm pressure that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from gasping. He knew. He knew the alpha was lying, and he knew I knew. He was playing with me. He was using the dinner table as a chessboard, and I was the piece he was currently fondling. "Perhaps," Declan continued, his voice dropping an octave, dragging over my nerves like velvet, "we should ask for a second opinion. Sometimes the quietest observers notice the things we miss." He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. The heat of his hand on my leg became unbearable, a brand of ownership. "What do you think, June? Do you like iron?" The table went silent. My father looked ready to weep. I stared into Declan's amusement-filled eyes, fighting the urge to recite the geothermal data verbatim. I fought the urge to lean into his touch. "Hard," I whispered, wide-eyed. "Iron is hard." Declan smirked, his thumb pressing dangerously high on my thigh for a fleeting second before retreating. "Indeed," he purred, turning back to the terrified alpha. "She makes a compelling point. Iron is hard, but my patience is harder. Fix the numbers, Thorn, or I will come mine it myself." Chapter 5. The Reflex. The dinner had been a torture session, disguised as a banquet. By the time the final course was cleared, My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I mumbled something about being tired and fled the great hall, needing the biting cold of the winter air to clear the fog of Declan's scent from my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the phantom pressure of his hand on my leg, the ghost of his heat branding my skin. I found a quiet spot on the lower terrace, hidden by the shadows of the stone archways. The snow was falling softly, muffling the sounds of the party inside. I leaned against the cold stone railing, inhaling the crisp night air, trying to slow my racing heart. I couldn't do this. I couldn't play this game with a creature like him. He was too smart, too observant, and far too interested. "Watch out!" The shout came from the service door to my left. A young servant boy had slipped on a patch of black ice, his arms flailing as he went down. He was carrying a massive silver tray loaded with crystal decanters and heavy goblets. My body moved before my brain could stop it. It was pure instinct, the result of years of training in secret to ensure I could defend myself if I ever escaped. I didn't gasp or freeze like a helpless girl. I pivoted on my heel, dropping my center of gravity, and lunged forward. My left hand caught the boy by the back of his tunic to break his fall, while my right hand snatched the heavy silver tray out of the air just inches before it hit the stones. Not a single glass shattered, not a drop of wine spilled. It was a move of fluid, lethal grace, over in a heartbeat. The boy stared at me, eyes wide, dangling from my grip. I stared back, the heavy tray balanced perfectly on my fingertips. Horror washed over me. I scrambled to correct it, to drop the tray, to act clumsy, but the moment had passed. The boy had seen it. I set him down and shoved the tray into his hands, my hands shaking. "Pretty, shiny," I stammered, backing away. "Good reflexes," a deep voice rumbled from above. I froze. Slowly, dread curling in my stomach like a poisonous vine, I looked up. High King Declan was standing on the balcony directly above me, a glass of dark liquor in his hand. He wasn't smiling. He was watching me with a dark, intense hunger that made the winter air feel suddenly scorching hot. He raised his glass in a silent toast, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He had seen everything. The balance, the speed, the strength. I turned and ran. I didn't limp. I didn't shuffle. I bolted toward the guest wing with the speed of a hunted doe. I couldn't stay here. The game was over. If I stayed, he would peel me apart, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the truth. And the truth would get me owned. I had to leave. Tonight. Chapter 6. No Escape. I threw my belongings into my battered leather satchel with frantic hands. 2 tunics, a spare pair of boots, the stash of credits I had stolen from my father's study over the last 3 years. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get me to the human border if I stole a horse. I didn't care about the snowstorm. I didn't care about the wolves patrolling the perimeter. I would take my chances with the elements rather than face the golden-eyed monster who looked at me like I was a riddle he intended to solve with his teeth. I yanked the straps of my bag tight and threw my heavy cloak over my shoulders. Taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands, I reached for the door handle. The door opened before I could touch it. Beta Kian, Declan's second-in-command, stood in the hallway. He was a mountain of a man with a scarred face and eyes that missed nothing, though they were currently filled with a polite, terrifying calmness. He looked at my travel bag, then up at my face. He didn't look surprised. "Going somewhere, Lady June?" he asked, his voice mild. "Walk," I said, pitching my voice into the higher simple register out of habit. "Just walk." "In a blizzard?" Kian raised a brow. "With a packed bag?" "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The king has requested your presence in his private quarters immediately. He mentioned something about a private tutoring session on pack history." My stomach dropped to the floor. Tutoring session. It was a mockery. "Tired," I said, trying to push past him. "Sleep now." Kian stepped into my path, blocking the hallway with his massive frame. He wasn't aggressive, which made it worse. He was immovable. It wasn't a request, my lady. It was a command, and High King Declan does not like to be kept waiting. I stared at him, calculating the odds of getting past him. 0. He was a beta of the Royal Guard. He could subdue me with one hand without spilling his drink. Fine, I snapped, dropping the simple act. My voice was cold, hard, and completely June. Kian's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. I didn't wait for him to recover. Yes, I shoved my bag back into the room and stormed past him, marching down the hallway toward the king's wing. If I was going to go down, I was going to go down fighting. I didn't knock. I shoved the heavy double doors of the king's chambers open with both hands, the wood banging against the stone walls with a satisfying crash. The room was warm, lit by a roaring fire that cast dancing shadows across the furs and tapestries. Declan was standing by the fireplace. He had discarded his formal coat and shirt, standing bare-chested in the firelight. His skin was marked with the white scars of 100 battles, his muscles corded and tense. He turned slowly as I entered, unbothered by my intrusion, unbothered by my anger. I stood there, chest heaving, hands balled into fists at my sides. I didn't slump. I didn't drool. I glared at him with every ounce of hatred and fear I possessed. Declan looked me up and down, taking in the straight spine, the blazing eyes, the defiant tilt of my chin. A slow, satisfied smile curved his lips, dark and dangerous, and utterly captivating. Finally, he breathed, the sound like a caress across the distance between us. There she is. I was wondering when the real June would show up to fight. Chapter 7. The Intellectual Seduction. I stood trembling in the center of the room, my hands balled into fists, waiting for the threats. I waited for him to blackmail me, to demand my body in exchange for his silence, or to call the guards to drag me to the dungeons for treason. I was ready for a fight. I was ready to scream, to scratch, to burn the entire Black Iron Manor to the ground before I let him use me as a political pawn. But Declan didn't move toward me. He didn't lock the door. He didn't even put on a shirt. Instead, he turned his back on my fury and walked calmly to the heavy mahogany desk dominated by a sprawling, chaotic mess of parchment. He picked up a crystal decanter, poured a generous amount of amber liquid into 2 glasses, and held one out to me without looking up. "Drink," he said, his voice maddeningly casual. "You look like you're about to vibrate out of your skin." I ignored the glass. "I don't want your drink. I want to know what game you are playing. You drag me here in the middle of the night, threaten me with exposure, and then stand there half-naked, acting like we are colleagues." "We are colleagues," Declan replied, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. He set the glass down and tapped a thick, wax-sealed document spread across the center of the desk. "At least we are tonight. Come here, June. Look at this." I didn't move. "I'm not a dog to come when called." "No," he agreed, his gold eyes finally lifting to meet mine, burning with that strange, intense hunger. "You are a wolf who is currently hiding the sharpest mind in the territory behind a mask of incompetence. And right now, that mind is the only thing that can save 3 battalions from being slaughtered in the Western Pass." The words hook into me deeper than any threat could have. My curiosity, always my fatal flaw, betrayed me. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, until I was standing on the opposite side of the desk. I looked down. It was a classified siege plan for the upcoming border skirmish with the Roguelands. It was detailed, complex, as and marked with the king's own aggressive handwriting, and it was wrong. The breath hissed through my teeth before I could stop it. "You're exposing the left flank," I blurted out, my fingers stabbing down onto the parchment. "If you move the heavy infantry through the valley here, there'll be bottlenecks by the snowdrift. The rogue archers will pick them off like fish in a barrel. You need to split the force and take the ridge." Declan didn't scold me. He didn't tell me to be quiet. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk, his face inches from mine. "The ridge is too steep for the supply wagons," he countered, his voice low and challenging. "We lose speed." "Speed doesn't matter if you're dead," I snapped, forgetting who he was, forgetting the fear. I grabbed a quill from the inkwell and slashed a line across his battle plan. "You abandon the wagons here. Pack the supplies on mules. It slows you down by 4 hours, but you keep the high ground. Are you trying to win a race? Or are you trying to win a war?" "I'm trying to win a war without bankrupting the treasury on mules," he shot back. But there was a light in his eyes, a fierce blazing delight that I had never seen directed at me before. "The mules require feed we don't have." "Then steal it from the rogue encampment on the way," I yelled, drawing a circle around the enemy supply depot. "They raided the southern farms last week. Take it back. It solves your feed problem and cripples their morale in one strike. It's efficient, it's brutal, it's obvious." We were shouting now, leaning over the desk, our faces flushed with the heat of the argument. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't editing myself. I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding, filling the room with my ideas, my strategy, my voice. And Declan wasn't shutting me down. He was meeting me, blow for blow, logic for logic. He wasn't treating me like a female to be protected or a subject to be ruled. He was treating me like an equal. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The shouting died in my throat. I looked up from the map, breathing hard, my hair escaping its pins to frame my flushed face. Declan was staring at me. He wasn't looking at the map anymore. He was looking at my mouth, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the gold of his irises. The air between us was suddenly so thick with tension, it felt like a storm about to break. We were enemies, we were strangers. But in this moment, staring at the carnage of red ink on the battle plan, we were perfectly aligned. He moved around the desk. I didn't retreat. I couldn't. I was held in place by the gravity of his presence. He stopped just inches from me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his bare chest, close enough to smell the intoxicating mix of whiskey, ink, and storm. "You are incredible," he murmured, his voice rough, stripped of all mockery. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of my neck, his thumb pressing into the racing pulse at my throat. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited for someone who could actually keep up with me?" I trembled under his touch, but I didn't pull away. My body was betraying me, leaning into him, craving the friction, the fire. I just fixed your map," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's just strategy." "It's not just strategy," Declan growled, in lowering his head until his lips brushed against mine, a hair's breadth away from a kiss that would ruin me. "It's power. And God, June, your mind is the sexiest thing in this entire territory." Chapter 8. The Public Humiliation. The Lady's Solar was a beautiful room designed for psychological warfare, disguised as afternoon tea. Sunlight streamed through the high-arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and catching the sparkle of diamond jewelry on the throats of the gathered women. To an outsider, it looked like a peaceful gathering of high-ranking females enjoying embroidery and gossip. To me, it was a shark tank where the water smelled of lavender and expensive perfume. I sat in the corner on a low stool, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea with both hands, staring blankly at the intricate tapestry on the far wall. My head was pounding. I hadn't slept more than an hour after leaving Declan's chambers, my mind still racing with supply lines, flank maneuvers, and the terrifying burning memory of his mouth almost touching mine. "Oh, look at her," a voice cooed, dripping with poisonous sweetness. "She's staring at the wall again. Do you think she sees fairies? Or is she just counting the bricks?" I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I knew that voice. Lady Vesper, the daughter of the Southern Alpha, and the woman most people assumed would be Declan's queen had made it her personal mission to torment me since the summit began. She glided toward me, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. She was undeniably beautiful, all sharp angles and confident grace. But her eyes held the cruelty of a bored cat playing with a mouse that had already lost its legs. "June," Vesper said loudly, drawing the attention of the entire room. "We were just discussing the upcoming ball. I suppose you won't be dancing. It must be so difficult for you, trying to remember the steps without tripping over your own feet." I offered her a loose, wobbly smile. "Music? Nice," I mumbled, slurring the sibilant sounds. Inside, I was dissecting her insecurities. "You're terrified because the king sat me at his right hand. You're attacking me because you feel your power slipping, and you don't understand why he looked at the idiot instead of you." Vesper's smile tightened. She didn't like that I wasn't cowering. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, holding her own steaming cup of tea dangerously close to my shoulder. "It's a shame, really," she sighed, tilting the cup. "You're practically a charity case for the pack, a waste of resources." Then with a deliberate flick of her wrist, she poured the scalding tea directly onto my lap. The pain was instantaneous and shocking. The hot liquid soaked through my thin dress, searing the sensitive skin of my thighs. My wolf roared in my head, demanding violence, demanding I leap up and tear this woman's throat out. But I couldn't. If I reacted with speed, if I dodged or fought back, the mask would slip. So I sat there. I let the tea burn me. I let the gasp turn into a confused whimper, shrinking away like a frightened animal, while the hot liquid dripped onto the expensive rug. "Oh dear," Vesper laughed, stepping back with feigned shock. "Look what you've done, you clumsy creature. You've ruined the carpet. And that dress, well, it wasn't much to look at before, but now it's positively tragic." The other women tittered behind their hands. Tears of genuine pain and humiliation pricked my eyes. It wasn't the burn that hurt the most. It was the helplessness. It was the fact that I was smarter than every single woman in this room, yet I had to sit here and let them treat me like garbage to survive. I started to stand, my legs trembling, intending to run. The double doors to the solar slammed open with a force that rattled the window panes. The laughter died instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 50 degrees in a single heartbeat. High King Declan stood in the doorway, filling the frame with his massive dark presence. He wasn't wearing his court finery. He was in training leathers, smelling of cold air, steel, and a storm about to break. His eyes swept the room, bypassing the bowing women, bypassing Vesper, and locking onto me. He saw the steam rising from my dress. He saw the red flush of the burn on my skin. He saw the tears I was trying to hold back. He didn't roar. He didn't shout. He walked into the room with a lethal, silent grace that was infinitely more terrifying than any outburst. The crowd parted for him, like the Red Sea, women scrambling to get out of his path. He stopped in front of me, ignoring Vesper completely, as if she were a piece of furniture. "Your Majesty?" Vesper stammered, her voice trembling. The girl, she's so clumsy, she spilled." "Silence," Declan said. It was spoken softly, but it cracked through the room like a whip. He looked down at me, his golden eyes burning with a rage so profound it made my breath hitch. But the rage wasn't directed at me. It was a shield, thick and impenetrable, slamming down between me and the world. He reached out, his large hand cupping my jaw, tilting my face up to his. He didn't check the rug. He didn't ask what happened. He simply looked at the tear tracking down my cheek and brushed it away with his thumb. "You have damaged my property, Lady Vesper," Declan said to the room, his voice devoid of emotion. "And you have insulted my guest. If I ever hear of you approaching her again, you will find yourself exiled to the northern wastes before sunset." Vesper gasped, falling to her knees. "Your Majesty, she is just a simpleton. She is nothing." She is worth 10 of you, Declan growled, the beast in his voice finally surfacing. Ina and she is under my protection. Before I could process what was happening, Declan bent down and swept me up into his arms. He didn't ask permission. He lifted me against his chest as easily as if I weighed nothing, cradling me high and tight against the hard wall of his body. My hands instinctively clutched his shoulders, burying my face in the crook of his neck to hide my shock. He turned on his heel, carrying me out of the shark tank, leaving a room full of stunned silence in his wake. As we crossed the threshold, he tightened his grip on me, his lips pressing a hard, furious kiss to the top of my head. I have you, he whispered into my hair, his heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. I have you, June. Burn the dress, burn the room. I don't care. No one touches you again. Chapter 9. Caretaking. The journey from the Lady's Solar to the King's private wing was a blur of stone corridors and terrified servants pressing themselves against the walls to avoid Declan's wrath. I was still clutched tight against his chest, my face buried in the heavy wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of storm and fury that clung to him. He didn't speak. He didn't look down. He simply marched with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide, carrying me as if I were a precious, broken thing that he intended to put back together. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. For 5 years, I had been invisible, a piece of furniture to be moved around or ignored. Now, held in the arms of the most dangerous predator on the continent, I felt more seen than I ever had in my life. He kicked the door to his private chambers open with a heavy boot, eased the wood, splintering slightly under the force, and carried me straight through the bedroom into the adjoining bathing room. It was a cavernous space of black marble and steam, lit by floating candles that cast a soft golden glow over the deep sunken tub. Declan set me down gently on the edge of the vanity counter, his hands lingering on my waist for a moment longer than necessary to ensure I was steady. His expression was grim, his jaw set in a hard line as he turned to the basin and twisted the brass tap. Cold water rushed out, echoing in the silence. "This is going to sting," he warned, his voice rough but low. He grabbed a soft linen cloth, soaked it in the icy water, and turned back to me. His eyes dropped to my lap, where the tea had soaked through the thin fabric of my dress, sticking the silk to my burned skin. "I need to move the skirt, June. Do I have your permission?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The question hung in the air, heavy with a respect I wasn't used to. He wasn't commanding me. He was asking. Gently, with fingers that trembled slightly, whether from rage or restraint, I couldn't tell. He gathered the hem of my ruined dress and pushed it up to my mid-thigh. The air hit the angry red welt on my skin, and I hissed through my teeth. The burn wasn't severe, but it was ugly, a testament to Vesper's cruelty. Declan knelt between my legs, his massive frame filling the space, and pressed the cold cloth against the injury. The relief was instantaneous, but it was quickly replaced by a different kind of heat. His head was bowed, his dark hair brushing against my knee as he focused entirely on tending to me. His hands were huge, capable of snapping necks, yet they moved with the reverence of a healer. He dabbed the cloth against my skin, cooling the fire, his touch so tender it made my chest ache. I watched him, mesmerized by the contrast. The king who could silence a room with a look was currently kneeling on a bathroom floor, cleaning tea stains off a girl everyone thought was an idiot. "Why didn't you move?" he asked quietly, not looking up. He rinsed the cloth and applied it again. "I saw you catch that tray yesterday. You have reflexes faster than my best guards. You could have dodged that tea before it even left her cup. Why did you sit there and let her burn you?" "Because if I dodge, they see me," I whispered, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. "If I show them I have reflexes, they wonder what else I have. If they see I'm fast, they'll think I'm strong. And if they think I'm strong, they'll sell me to the highest bidder in the next territory war." Declan stopped, His hands froze on my leg. Slowly, he looked up, his golden eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that pinned me to the marble counter. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You think strength makes you a product?" "It does for women like me," I countered, my voice gaining a desperate edge. "Smart women are tools, Declan. We are used to balance ledgers, to breed heirs with better genetics, to manage estates while the alphas play war. I don't want to be a tool. I don't want to be useful. I want to be free. If being dumb keeps me off the auction block, then I will let them pour boiling water on me every day for the rest of my life." He stood up then, towering over me, casting a shadow that should have been frightening but felt like shelter. He tossed the cloth into the basin and stepped into my space, placing his hands on the counter on either side of my hips, trapping me in a cage of his own making. But there was no aggression in him now, only a fierce, burning conviction. "You are looking at the wrong men, June," he murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against mine. "Weak men want tools. Weak men want wives they can use and discard. I am not a weak man." He moved his hand from the counter to my wrist, his fingers wrapping around the delicate bones, finding the frantic pulse beating beneath my skin. He lifted my hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss right over the vein, a gesture so intimate, so claiming, that my breath hitched in my throat. His lips lingered there, warm and firm, sending a jolt of pure electricity straight to my heart. "I don't want to use you," he breathed against my skin, his eyes burning into mine. "I don't want a ledger keeper. I have thousands of those. I want the fire I saw in the library. I want the woman who corrects my battle maps and catches falling glass. I don't want to own you, June. I want to unleash you." Chapter 10. The Mating Games. The mating games of the Nightfall territory were a misnomer that suggested something primal, exciting, and perhaps a little dangerous. In reality, it was just a high-stakes cattle auction with better appetizers and a string quartet. My father had spent the last 3 hours forcing me into a gown of ice blue silk that was so tight I could barely expand my lungs to breathe, let alone run. He had polished me like a tarnished spoon, desperate to present me as a viable option for any alpha desperate enough, or greedy enough, to overlook the fact that his daughter was widely considered to have the mental capacity of a turnip. I stood near a towering ice sculpture of a wolf, clutching a glass of sparkling cider with both hands, trying to make myself look as small and unappealing as possible while the room swirled with the frantic energy of social climbers. From my vantage point, I could see the entire battlefield. I watched Lunas preening in their diamonds, flashing their throats to potential mates. I watched alphas puffing out their chests, trading boastful lies about their territory sizes and kill counts. It was all a performance, a desperate dance of biology and politics, and I hated every second of it. My only solace was the silent, a brooding figure seated on the raised dais at the far end of the hall. High King Declan sat on his velvet throne like a statue carved from midnight and disapproval. He held a goblet of wine loosely in one hand, staring out at the festivities with an expression of profound, terrifying boredom. He looked like a predator trapped in a cage of polite society, waiting for an excuse to bite someone. Our eyes met across the crowded room. It was a brief electric connection that made the breath hitch in my throat. He didn't smile, but his gaze sharpened, tracking me as I shifted uncomfortably in my corset. I quickly looked away, feigning fascination with the melting ice wolf, terrified that if I held his gaze too long, I would give away the game. I couldn't afford to be seen by him tonight. Not when half the unmated males in the room were looking for a weak link to exploit. Unfortunately, looking away wasn't enough. A heavy shadow fell over me, blocking the light from the chandeliers. I smelled stale beer and cheap musk before I even turned around. It was an alpha from the minor bog territories, a man with a thick neck and eyes that gleamed with a cruel, opportunistic light. He had been watching me for the last hour, calculating the value of my father's dowry against the burden of my condition. Well now, the alpha grunted, stepping into my personal space until I was pressed against the cold, wet table of the ice sculpture. Aren't you a pretty little thing? Shame about the head, though. I kept my face blank, my mouth slightly open. Pretty ice, I murmured, pointing a trembling finger at the sculpture. Eon cold. The alpha laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Yeah, ice is cold. You know what's warm? My bed. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my flesh with bruising force. Come on, girl. Your father is desperate to offload you. I bet he'd give me 300 acres just to take you off his hands. You don't need to be smart to be useful to a pack like mine. You just need to be obedient. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. This was the nightmare scenario. If he dragged me onto the floor and claimed me publicly, my father would agree before I could even blink. I tensed my muscles, calculating the trajectory to break his nose. A quick palm strike upward would shatter the cartilage and blind him with tears, giving me 3 seconds to vanish. But if I did that, the mask would shatter. Everyone would see June the warrior, not June the simpleton. I would be exposed. Let go, I whined, trying to pull away clumsily, hoping he would lose interest. Hurts. It's supposed to hurt, he sneered, yanking me harder, dragging me toward the center of the room. That's how you know who's in charge. I planted my feet, ready to strike, ready to burn my entire life to the ground rather than submit to this brute. But before I could unleash the violence coiled in my muscles, the music stopped. It didn't fade out. It was silenced, as if the musicians had been struck mute. A hush swept through the hall, starting from the dais and rippling outward like a shockwave. The air temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single heartbeat. The alpha holding me froze, his grip loosening as a scent washed over us. Ozone, rain. I'm on the terrifying, suffocating weight of absolute power. I looked up. High King Declan was no longer on his throne. He was standing directly behind the bog alpha, looming over him like the angel of death. He didn't look bored anymore. His golden eyes were burning with a cold, white-hot fury that made my knees weak. I believe, Declan said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that echoed off the stone walls, that the lady said you were hurting her. The bog alpha turned pale, releasing my arm as if I were made of molten lead. He stammered, backing away, shrinking under the king's glare. Your Majesty, she doesn't understand. She understands enough to know she doesn't want your hands on her. Declan cut him off, stepping between us. He placed a hand on the alpha's chest and shoved him. A casual, to dismissive push that sent the massive man stumbling back 10 feet into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. The crash of breaking glass punctuated the silence. Declan didn't even watch him fall. He turned his back on the room, creating a wall of broad shoulders and black velvet between me and the rest of the world. He looked down at me, his rage fading into something darker, something more intimate and possessive as he took in my trembling form. He extended a hand toward me, palm up, waiting. Dance with me, he commanded softly, his eyes locking onto mine with a gravity that made refusal impossible. Now, Chapter 11. The Waltz of Lies. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual gossip and political maneuvering. Every eye in the room was fixed on the High King's outstretched hand, and by extension, on me. To refuse him was treason. To accept him was suicide. If I danced with him, I stepped into the blinding spotlight of his attention, exposing myself to the scrutiny of every jealous Luna and calculating alpha in the territory. But looking at Declan's face, hard, expectant, and burning with a challenge that had nothing to do with politics, I knew I had no choice. He wasn't asking. He was daring me to keep playing my game while he held me in his arms. I placed my hand in his. It was a trembling, hesitant motion, consistent with the terrified simpleton I was pretending to be. But the moment our skin touched, the pretense felt paper-thin. His fingers closed around mine, warm and calloused, engulfing my hand with a shocking sense of possession. He pulled me to my feet, not with a jerk, but with a steady, irresistible gravity, as if I were a moon, and he was the planet I was destined to orbit. "Music!" Declan barked over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off my face. The quartet scrambled to obey, their bows screeching against the strings for a split second before finding the rhythm of a slow, heavy waltz. Declan stepped into my space, his large hands sliding around my waist to rest on the curve of my lower back. The heat of him seeped through the silk of my dress, branding me, burning away the chill of the room. I stiffened instinctively, locking my knees, preparing to step on his toes or trip over the hem of my gown. I had to be clumsy. I had to be uncoordinated. I had to remind everyone that I was a burden, not a prize. I stumbled deliberately on the first beat, throwing my weight to the left. Declan didn't let me fall. He didn't even stumble. His arm tightened around my waist like an iron band, lifting me effortlessly and correcting my balance before my foot could even drag against the floor. He pulled me flush against his chest, eliminating the polite distance required by court etiquette, forcing my thighs to brush against his with every step. "Don't," he murmured against my hair, his voice a low vibration that rattled my ribcage. "Don't you dare trip, June. Not with me." "Can't dance," I whispered, keeping my eyes wide and panicked, staring at the pulse beating in his throat. "Too fast. Feet tangled." "Your feet are perfectly fine," he countered, spinning us through a turn, with a grace that belied his massive size. "I've seen you run on ice. I've seen you catch falling silver. Stop fighting me." For 5 minutes, "I just stop fighting me and let yourself be held." The command was so gentle, so laced with a raw, aching need, that my resistance crumbled. It was exhausting to be clumsy. It was exhausting to be constantly vigilant, constantly shrinking. The music swelled, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around us, isolating us from the hundreds of staring eyes. I took a breath, inhaling the scent of rain and authority that clung to him, and I let go. I stopped locking my knees. I stopped dragging my feet. I let my body remember the lessons I had secretly watched from the balcony as a child. I matched his stride, moving in perfect sync with him. We glided across the polished floor, a single entity moving through the candlelight. It was intoxicating. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't stumbling through life. I was flying. Declan's hand splayed wide across my back, guiding me with subtle shifts of his weight, and I responded instantly, anticipating his turns before he even signaled them. We were a scandal. I could feel the shock rippling through the room, the king dancing with the village idiot, and the idiot dancing like a queen. But I didn't care. For this one song, I wasn't June the Simple. I was just June. And I was in the arms of the only man who had ever looked at me and seen the truth. "There she is," Declan whispered, his lips brushing the shell of my ear as he dipped me low, his eyes blazing with triumph. "I knew you could fly." The final note of the waltz hung in the air, vibrating with the tension between us. We slowed to a stop, but he didn't let go. We stood there, chests heaving, locked in a gaze that felt more intimate than a kiss. And I felt powerful. I felt seen. Then the applause started, scattered and confused at first, then polite. The bubble burst. The reality of the room rushed back in. The whispers, the stares, the calculations. I blinked, the fog of the dance clearing, and I saw my father, Alpha Jareth, pushing his way through the crowd toward us. He wasn't looking at me with his usual shame or irritation. He was looking at me the way a merchant looks at a pile of gold coins he just discovered in his basement. His eyes were wide, greedy, and terrifyingly calculating. He looked from Declan's possessive hand on my waist to my flushed face, and a slow, oily smile spread across his lips. "Your Majesty," Jareth boomed, bowing low but keeping his hungry eyes fixed on me. "I see my daughter has exceeded expectations, but perhaps we have been too hasty in judging her value to the pack. If she pleases the king, then surely her bride price must be reconsidered." My blood ran cold. The magic of the waltz disintegrated into ash. I had made a fatal error. I had shown competence. I had shown grace. And in doing so, I hadn't saved myself. I had just put a higher price tag on my head. Chapter 12. The Panic. I pulled my hand from Declan's grip the moment the music died, retreating from the warmth of his chest as if I had been burned. The applause of the court sounded like the rattling of chains, and my father's greedy, calculating stare was the lock snapping shut. I didn't wait for a dismissal. I mumbled a frantic, incoherent apology about needing air and fled the ballroom, on stumbling over the hem of my silk gown in a performance of clumsiness that felt far too real. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a warning drum beating out a single message: run, hide, erase. I didn't go to my room. I knew my father would come looking for me there, ready to appraise me like a prize mare. Instead, I slipped into the narrow servants' corridor that ran behind the main parlor, a dusty, spider-webbed passage I had discovered 3 winters ago. I pressed my ear against the cold stone of the wall, holding my breath as heavy footsteps vibrated through the floorboards on the other side. "You saw the way he looked at her." My father's voice drifted through the cracks in the masonry, thick with excitement and wine. The High King held her for the entire waltz. He didn't look at Lady Vesper once. He wants her. "She is simple, Alpha Jareth," the advisor's voice replied, hesitant. "The king is a strategist. Why would he want a mate who cannot read a treaty?" "Who cares why?" Jareth snapped, the sound of glass hitting a table echoing sharply. "Whatever fetish he has for broken things is none of my concern. My concern is the price. If he wants the girl, he pays for the girl. I will demand the mining rights to the Silver Creek Basin. No, I will demand a seat on the High Council. He won't refuse. Did you see his hand on her waist? He's obsessed." I slid down the wall until I hit the dusty floor, burying my face in my knees. The nausea was overwhelming. I had been right. My worst nightmare wasn't being ignored. It was being valued for the wrong reasons. My father didn't see a daughter. He saw a bargaining chip that had suddenly appreciated in value. And Declan was the buyer. Even if his interest was genuine, even if he liked my mind to the rest of the world, I was just a commodity to be traded for mineral rights. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't be sold. A cold, hard resolve settled in my chest, freezing the panic into something sharp and usable. There was only one way to stop this transaction. I had to depreciate the asset. If the king was disgusted by me, the deal would fall through. My father would be humiliated, the pack would lose interest, and I would return to being the invisible, worthless June. I needed to do something so erratic, so embarrassing, that Declan would have no choice but to reject me publicly. I stood up, dusting the cobwebs from my skirt. I wiped the tears from my cheeks with a furious swipe of my hand. I would go to him. I would go to his study, where I knew he worked late, and I would stage a tantrum. I would scream. I would throw inkwells. I would act like a spoiled, unhinged child until he ordered the guards to drag me away. It would destroy my reputation, but it would save my life. I marched through the silent corridors of Black Iron Manor, rehearsing my lines. "I want the moon. Give me the shiny thing." It tasted like ash in my mouth, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached the heavy oak door of the king's private study, my hand hovering over the iron handle. I took a deep breath, summoned the ghost of every tantrum I had ever witnessed, and shoved the door open. "I won't do it!" I prepared to shout, ready to fling a vase across the room. But the words died in my throat. The vase stayed in my hand. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire and a single oil lamp on the massive desk. The air smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion. Declan was there, but he wasn't the terrifying monarch I had prepared to fight. He was sitting slumped in his chair, his jacket discarded on the floor, his white shirt unbuttoned to reveal the hollow of his throat. His head was buried in his hands, his fingers tangled in his dark hair as he massaged his temples in a gesture of utter crushing defeat. He looked human. He looked lonely. Spread out before him wasn't a treaty or a weapon, but the same supply map I had fixed days ago, now covered in new frantic red marks. He was trying to save his people from starvation, and he was failing. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a treacherous magnetic pull that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the man sitting alone in the dark. I stood frozen in the doorway, my plan forgotten, watching the king of the Nightfall territory breaking under the weight of his crown. Chapter 13. The Mask Shatters. I stood in the doorway, clutching the porcelain vase I had planned to smash against the wall, my knuckles turning white with the force of my grip. The tantrum I had rehearsed died in my throat, choked off by the sight of the most powerful man in the territory, looking like he was carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He hadn't heard me enter. He was too engrossed in the map spread before him, his fingers tangled in his hair, muttering curses under his breath as he stared at the supply lines I had corrected days ago. But now there were new problems. New red ink slashing across the parchment, marking collapsed bridges and flooded roads. He looked exhausted, defeated, and utterly alone. My anger evaporated, replaced by a treacherous magnetic pull. I knew I should leave. I should let him struggle. I should enact my plan to humiliate myself and force him to reject me. But seeing the desperation in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped under the burden of leadership, I felt a crack in my resolve. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. I knew what it felt like to be the only person in the room who understood the problem, but lacked the power to fix it. Only now I had the power, and he was the one lacking the solution. I set the vase down on a side table with a soft clink. Declan didn't look up. He rubbed his face with his hands, a groaning low in his throat. Useless, he muttered to the empty room. Whatever path I choose, half the convoy freezes. I need a miracle, not a map. My feet moved before my brain gave permission. I walked silently across the thick rug, the heavy silk of my gown rustling softly. I stopped beside his chair, looking down at the map. It was a mess. He was trying to force the supply wagons through the old mining tunnels to avoid the blizzard, but he had forgotten the ventilation shafts were blocked by rockfalls 3 winters ago. If he sent them that way, the carbon monoxide would kill every driver and mule within the hour. I reached out, picked up the quill from the inkwell, and drew a thick black line through the tunnel route. Declan jerked as if he had been burned, spinning in his chair, yet his hand going instinctively to the dagger at his belt. But when he saw it was me, the aggression drained out of him instantly, replaced by a stunned, wide-eyed shock. He stared at the line I had drawn, then up at my face. I wasn't slumping. I wasn't drooling. I was standing straight, the quill still in my hand, looking him dead in the eye. "The ventilation shafts are collapsed," I said, my voice clear, sharp, and completely devoid of the stammer I had worn for 5 years. "The carbon monoxide levels in the lower tunnels are lethal. You'll kill your men before they reach the midpoint." Declan gaped at me. For the first time since I had met him, the High King was speechless. He looked from the map to me, his mouth opening and closing. "June?" he whispered, as if he wasn't sure I was real. "Go over the ridge," I continued, yet ignoring his shock, leaning over the desk to tap a specific point on the map. "Use the goat tracks. They're narrow, but the wind shear keeps them clear of snow. If you break the convoy into single-file sleds instead of wagons, you can make the crossing in 2 days. You lose speed, but you save the cargo. I sketched the new route quickly, my hand flying across the parchment with practiced ease. I marked the wind patterns, the elevation changes, the optimal rest points. When I finished, I dropped the quill on the desk and stepped back, breathing hard. The silence in the room was deafening. I realized what I had done. I had just exposed myself completely. There was no going back to simple June after explaining atmospheric pressure differentials and logistical restructuring. Declan stood slowly. He didn't look at the map. He looked at me with an intensity that made the air crackle. He walked around the desk, stalking toward me with a predatory grace that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I backed up until my legs hit the edge of a bookshelf, trapping me. He stopped inches away, looming over me, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of awe and fury. "Why?" he demanded, his voice rough. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip hard but not painful. "You were going to run. You were going to let me think you were broken." "Why help me now?" "Because you're the only one who isn't stupid," I yelled, the words tearing out of me in a rush of pent-up frustration. I tried to yank my arm back, but he held fast. "Because watching you try to send your men into a death trap was physically painful." Because I am tired of pretending that I don't know the answer, just so men like my father won't sell me for a handful of silver." Declan froze. His grip on my wrist softened, his thumb brushing over the frantic pulse point. He looked at my flushed face, my heaving chest, the fire in my eyes that matched his own. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his lips. Not the dark, mocking smile I was used to, but something open, genuine, and terrifyingly tender. "Finally," he breathed, leaning down until our foreheads touched. "Finally, she speaks." Chapter 14. The Confession. The silence that followed my outburst was absolute, heavier than the stone walls surrounding us. But for the first time in 5 years, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like the sudden, ringing quiet after a thunderstorm breaks. I stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the backlash. I waited for the king to call the guards, to accuse me of treason, or to laugh at the absurdity of the village idiots screaming about ventilation shafts. But Declan did none of those things. He simply stood there, his hand still warm around my wrist, staring at me with an expression that was terrifyingly open. A mixture of awe, vindication, and something raw that looked dangerously like relief. "You knew," I whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of me, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. My knees gave way, not from acting, but from the sheer physical toll of the adrenaline crash. "You knew the whole time." Declan caught me before I could stumble, his arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me hard against his chest, holding me upright when my own legs refused to do the job. He didn't say a word, but he just buried his face in the crook of my neck and inhaled deeply, breathing me in like I was the oxygen he had been suffocating without. The sensation of his solid warmth, the smell of rain and ink and male scent, broke something fragile inside me. The dam I had built 5 years ago, the wall of silence, the feigned stupidity, the constant grinding loneliness, cracked and shattered. A sob tore itself from my throat, ugly and jagged. I tried to stifle it, pressing my hand over my mouth, but another one followed, and then another. I was crying. I was standing in the arms of the High King, weeping with the force of 5 years of repressed rage and fear. I grabbed the front of his shirt, twisting the fabric in my fists, burying my face against his shoulder to hide the shame of my unraveling. "I'm so tired," I choked out, and my voice muffled against his chest. "I am so tired of being nothing. I'm tired of listening to them talk about me like I'm a piece of furniture, like I'm broken livestock to be bartered for mining rights. Do you have any idea what it's like to scream inside your own head every single day, just to keep from screaming out loud?" Declan didn't try to hush me. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to calm down. He simply held me tighter. One large hand stroking the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair, anchoring me to the earth while I weathered the storm. He let me cry until the tears turned to dry, heaving breaths, until the shaking in my limbs subsided into a dull tremor. Only then did he pull back slightly, just enough to tilt my chin up with his thumb, forcing me to look at him. His golden eyes were dark, fierce, and utterly devoid of pity. "I don't know what it's like to hide," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know what it's like to be surrounded by people who only see what they want to see. They see a king. They see a weapon. They don't see the man who stays up until dawn, trying to figure out how to keep his people from freezing." He used his thumbs to wipe the tears from my cheeks, his touch reverent, as if my grief was something precious. I didn't fall for the act, June. I fell for the cracks in it. I fell for the girl who catches silver trays and corrects my math in the dark. I fell for the silence because it was the only honest thing in this entire palace. But my father... I sniffed, leaning into his touch despite myself. He wants to sell me. He thinks you want a pet. If you claim me, that's what everyone will think. That I'm just your conquest. "Let them think what they want," Declan growled, a dangerous edge entering his tone. He lifted me easily, setting me on the edge of his desk, settling himself between my legs so we were eye to level. "They are fools playing a game they don't understand. But you and we aren't playing anymore." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breath mingling with mine. "I don't want a pet, June. I have hounds for that. I don't want a consort to warm my bed and breed my heirs. I can find that anywhere." His hands slid up my arms to cup my face, his gaze burning with a promise that felt more binding than any marriage contract. "I need a strategist. I need someone who understands that saving the convoy is more important than protocol. I don't want a queen who sits on a throne and waves at the crowds while I bleed for this kingdom. I want a partner who will bleed with me. I want the mind that drew that line on the map. I want you." Chapter 15. The Betrayal. The morning light, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains of the council chamber, was cold and unforgiving, much like the mood in the room. I stood alone in the center of the polished stone floor, my hands clasped tightly in front of me to hide their trembling. My father, Alpha Jareth, paced back and forth like a caged predator, his face a mottled mask of fury and greed. He had burst into my room at dawn, flanked by 2 of his own guards, and dragged me here before I could even wash my face. He had found them, my journals. The ones hidden beneath the loose floorboard in my closet, the ones filled with years of observations, economic theories, and scathing critiques of his own leadership. "Deceit!" Jareth roared, slamming one of the leather-bound books onto the heavy oak table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Years of deceit, playing the fool while you mocked me in secret, while you stole my private correspondence and critiqued my trade agreements." I flinched, not from the noise, but from the violation. Those journals were my mind. They were the only place I existed. To see them spread out like evidence of a crime felt like being stripped naked in front of the entire High Council. And they were all here, the elders, the visiting alphas, the whispering lunas. They looked at me with a mixture of shock and disdain, murmuring behind their hands. The girl they thought was simple was actually a spy in their midst. "She is a liability," an elder shouted from the back, pointing a gnarled finger at me. "A manipulator. If she can feign incompetence for 5 years, what else is she capable of? She could be selling our secrets to the rogue packs." "She is selling secrets," Jareth countered, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "Look at this. Detailed maps of the southern defenses, notes on the grain reserves. She has been gathering intelligence right under my nose. I demand justice. I demand she be stripped of her rank and exiled to the wastes. My heart hammered against my ribs. Exile to the wastes was a death sentence. It was a frozen, lawless land where rogue wolves hunted for sport. My father wasn't just angry, he was terrified. He realized that if the king found out I was smart, he might not pay the bride price. He might just take me. Or worse, he might realize how incompetent Jareth actually was. So my father was cutting his losses. He was sacrificing me to save his own reputation. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to scream that I had only ever tried to help, but the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open with a groan of protesting hinges. The room fell instantly silent. High King Declan strode in, flanked by Batakian and 4 of his elite royal guard. He didn't look at the council. He didn't look at my father. He looked straight at me, his golden eyes dark and unreadable. He was dressed for war, black leather armor, heavy boots, and a sword strapped to his hip. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, and the scent of ozone and impending storm rolling off him in waves. "What is the meaning of this?" Declan asked, his voice low and dangerous, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Majesty," Jareth stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "My daughter, she is a fraud, a spy. We found these journals. She has been documenting our defenses, our weaknesses. She has been pretending to be simple to infiltrate our councils." Declan walked slowly to the table. He picked up the journal Jareth had thrown. He opened it, his eyes scanning the page I knew by heart, the entry where I calculated the optimal rotation for the sentry guards to minimize fatigue. He read it in silence, his expression betraying nothing. The council held its breath. I held mine, praying he wouldn't let them kill me. Then Declan closed the book with a snap. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the trembling council members before settling on my father with a look of utter contempt. "You call this spying?" Declan asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I call it competence." "But the deception," Jareth spluttered. "She lied to the pack. She lied to you." "She did not lie to me," Declan said smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with the weight of absolute truth. He stepped forward, placing a possessive hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my muscle through the thin fabric of my dress. "Lady June has been acting under my direct orders for the past 6 months. She is my covert operative. Her simplicity was a cover I authorized to test the loyalty and security of this very council." The room erupted in gasps. I stared up at him, shocked to my core. He was rewriting history. He was claiming me not just as a mate, but as his agent. He was giving me power. "And from what I see in these journals," Declan continued, his voice rising over the noise, "she has identified 3 major security flaws that you incompetent fools missed. She hasn't betrayed this pack, Jareth. She has saved it." He looked down at me then, his golden eyes burning with a fierce protective pride that made my knees weak. He squeezed my shoulder, a silent promise. "Clear the room," he commanded the guards, never breaking eye contact with me. I wished to debrief my agent. Alone. Chapter 16. The Claiming. The heavy oak doors groaned shut, the sound echoing like a finalized sentence that sealed the rest of the world outside. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the lingering adrenaline of the confrontation. Then I stared at the wood grain of the council table, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, unable to fully process the magnitude of the lie Declan had just woven into existence. He hadn't just saved me, he had rewritten my entire identity. In the span of 3 minutes, he had transformed me from a treacherous daughter into a royal asset, shielding me with his own reputation. I turned slowly. Declan was leaning against the heavy doors, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me with an expression that was terrifyingly open. The mask of the imperious High King was gone, replaced by the raw burning hunger of a man who had just staked his claim in front of the entire territory. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply waited, letting the weight of his protection settle around me like a warm cloak. "You lied," I whispered, the words trembling in the air. "You lied to the High Council. You lied to the elders. You risked your credibility for a girl who pretended to be dumb." "I improvised," Declan corrected, pushing off the door and stalking toward me. His strides were long, purposeful, eating up the distance between us. And I didn't risk anything I wasn't willing to lose. Credibility is a currency, June. I spent it to buy something far more valuable. He stopped inches from me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the dilation of his pupils. He wasn't looking at me like a spy or an asset. He was looking at me like I was the only water in a desert. Something inside me snapped. The fear, the relief, the exhaustion, it all coalesced into a blinding need to bridge the final gap. I didn't think. And I didn't calculate. For the first time in my life, I acted on pure, unadulterated instinct. I reached up, grabbed the lapels of his leather armor, and yanked him down. I kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision. It was a desperate, messy, claiming thing, fueled by 5 years of silence and the sudden, overwhelming freedom of being seen. I poured everything into it. My gratitude, my rage, my desire. Declan froze for a fraction of a second, stunned by my aggression, before a low growl ripped from his throat. He wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me off the ground and crushing me against his chest. His mouth devoured mine, hot and demanding, tasting of coffee and the dark, intoxicating flavor of power. He walked us backward until my back hit the heavy edge of the council table. He lifted me onto it, scattering the journals, my mind, my soul, across the polished wood. "June," he groaned against my lips, his hands tangling in my hair, tilting my head back to expose my throat. "Do you have any idea how long I have wanted to hear you make a sound that wasn't a lie?" "Then make me," I gasped, my hands gripping his shoulders, anchoring myself in the storm. "Make it real, Declan. No more masks, no more hiding. Claim me. If I am your agent, then bind me to you. If I am yours, then make sure everyone knows it." He didn't hesitate, his eyes burning with molten gold locked onto mine, asking a silent question that went deeper than flesh. I nodded, baring my neck to him, offering him the most vulnerable part of myself. He lowered his head, his breath hot against my pulse, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin right over the mating gland. "You are not my agent," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You are my equal. You are the only person in this world who sees the man behind the crown." Then he bit down. The pain was sharp, sudden, and immediately followed by a flood of endorphins that turned my blood to liquid fire. I cried out, arching into him, feeling the bond snap into place like a steel cable connecting our souls. It was a rush of sensation. His strength, his possessiveness, his absolute adoration, flooding my mind, drowning out the last lingering whispers of fear. I was no longer alone in my head. I felt him there, a massive, comforting presence, standing guard over my thoughts. He pulled back slowly, licking the mark he had left on my skin, soothing the bite. He rested his forehead against mine, his chest heaving, his eyes squeezed shut as he rode out the aftershocks of the claiming. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing in sync, existing in the quiet center of the hurricane we had just created. Finally, Declan opened his eyes. The gold was brighter now, settled, triumphant. He reached up and traced the mark on my neck with his thumb, a possessive smirk curving his lips. "Well," he murmured, his voice laced with dark humor and deep satisfaction. "Now that we have successfully committed treason against the council and mated in the war room, we have a kingdom to reorganize. Where do we start, my queen?" I laughed, the sound bubbling up free and uninhibited. I pulled him back down for a quick, searing kiss. "The grain supply," I whispered against his mouth. And then, "We fire my father." Declan grinned, a wolfish expression that promised chaos and glory. "I love the way you think." Chapter 17. The Queen of Nightfall. The afternoon sun sliced through the high windows of the council chamber, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the sheen of sweat on Alpha Thorn's forehead. 3 months ago, this room had been a place of terror for me, a courtroom where my journals were displayed like evidence of a crime. Today, it was my office. I stood at the head of the heavy oak table, not cowering, not slumping, but standing at my full height in a gown of midnight blue wool that was tailored to fit the woman I actually was, not the child I had pretended to be. My hair was pinned back severely, revealing the mating mark on my neck, a scar that had healed into a silver crescent, a permanent declaration of exactly who I belonged to, and more importantly, who belonged to me. "Your projections for the southern harvest are optimistic, Alpha Thorn," I said, my voice cool and echoing clearly off the stone walls. I didn't shout, but the authority in my tone made the gathered delegates sit up straighter. "Optimistic and mathematically impossible. You've calculated the yield based on a standard summer rotation, but you ignored the frost reports from the eastern ridge. If we use your numbers, the Nightfall territory starves by mid-February." Thorn shifted in his seat, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. He looked toward the door, as if hoping for salvation, but there was none coming. My father, Alpha Jareth, had been retired to a comfortable, distant estate near the coast where he could no longer sell his kin for mining rights. There was no one here to interrupt me. We assumed the geothermal vents would offset the chill, Your Majesty," Thorn stammered, addressing me by the title that still sent a thrill of disbelief racing through my veins. The soil temperature drops 3 degrees for every 10 yards of elevation," I cut him off, picking up a piece of chalk and slashing a correction across the slateboard behind me. "You need to pivot to root vegetables in the lower valley and save the grain for the sheltered silos. Rework the logistics by tomorrow morning, or I will find a quartermaster who knows the difference between a turnip and a tragedy." The room fell into a stunned, reverent silence. It was the kind of silence I used to fear, in the kind that meant I had been seen. Now I drank it in. It was the sound of respect. It was the sound of safety. I turned back to the table, ready to dismiss them, when the heavy double doors creaked open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sharpening of attention, a collective inhale. High King Declan stood in the doorway. He was dressed in his training leathers, mud spattered on his boots, and wind-tangled hair falling into his eyes, looking every inch the wild, dangerous predator that ruled this frozen land. He leaned against the doorframe with a casual, predatory grace, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't speak. He just watched me. His golden eyes tracked my movement with a heavy, simmering heat that made my skin prickle and my breath hitch. "Gentlemen," Declan rumbled, his voice low but carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "Unless you want to explain to me why you are wasting my queen's time with bad math, I suggest you leave." The sound of scraping chairs was deafening as the delegation scrambled to evacuate. Thorn bowed so low his nose nearly brushed the floor before scurrying past the king like a frightened rabbit. Declan didn't even glance at them. His gaze was locked on me, burning with a mixture of pride and a dark, possessive hunger that made my knees weak. When the doors finally clicked shut, leaving us alone in the sudden quiet, the professional mask I had worn all afternoon melted away. I let out a long breath, leaning back against the edge of the heavy table. Declan pushed off the doorframe and stalked toward me, the predator finally closing in on his prey. He stopped inches away, so invading my personal space in the way only he was allowed to do, and placed his large, warm hands on my waist. "You were terrifying," he murmured. his thumb brushing over the silk of my dress, tracing the curve of my hip. I could hear you dressing down Thorn from the hallway. I think he's afraid of you. Good, I replied, reaching up to loop my arms around his neck, tangling my fingers in his dark hair. Fear makes people double-check their equations, and his equations were sloppy. Declan laughed, a rich, deep sound that vibrated against my chest. He lowered his head, his nose brushing against mine, his breath mingling with mine. You are running this kingdom better than I ever did, he admitted, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. The convoys are on time. The granaries are full. But I'm starting to think you only keep me around for my sword arm. And your ability to intimidate the Southern Council, I teased, tilting my head to give him better access to my neck. And perhaps a few other talents. He groaned, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below my ear, sending a jolt of lightning straight to my core. I live to serve, my queen. He pulled back slightly, his golden eyes searching my face, looking for any trace of the girl who used to hide in the shadows. He wouldn't find her. She was gone, replaced by the woman he had pulled into the light. A mischievous thought struck me. I let my jaw go slack for just a second, widening my eyes in a parody of my old vacant stare. I tapped a finger against his chest. Pretty king, I slurred softly. Declan froze, his eyes widening in shock. Before he saw the corner of my mouth twitch, I winked, a sharp, deliberate, knowing wink that shattered the ghost of the past. He roared with laughter, sweeping me up into his arms and spinning me around until the room blurred into streaks of golden stone. He crushed me against his chest, burying his face in my hair, shaking with mirth and relief. When he finally set me down, he looked at me with a love so fierce it stole the air from my lungs. I fixed the grain surplus, I whispered, resting my forehead against his. Declan smiled, pressing a kiss to my brow. I never doubted you would, my queen. And just like that, the mask is finally gone. I hope your heart is full right now. There is something so healing about seeing a character finally get the respect and the love she has fought so hard for. If June and Declan's story claimed a piece of your soul tonight, please leave a like on this video. It tells the algorithm that our pack is strong and helps us find other listeners in the dark. If you aren't part of the family yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. The library is always open, and I have so many more obsession-worthy stories waiting for you. Now I want to hear your voice. What was the moment that made you fall for Declan? Was it the library scene, the dance, or when he defended her against the council? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments. And as always, tell me where you are listening from tonight, whether you're tucked in bed in London or driving through the rain in Texas. I read every single one. Until the next story, sweet dreams.